I see that it's recording.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you all for coming to hear from our author, Kimberly Hess. And I met Kimberly back when Hillary ran, and we had that fabulous headquarters on Main Street with all those rooms and lots of volunteers coming in. And Kimberly helped me with phone banking and other things at the office. And shortly, actually, she was pregnant while she came. And then shortly after that, she had her child, and she went on to write this book that we're all going to hear about this evening. So I'll let her tell her story.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate your inviting me to speak. I'm actually doing this as the first presentation about the book, so I appreciate your going on the maiden voyage with the microphone and the lighting and everything that's getting used for it. The book is called A Lesser Mortal, The Unexpected Life of Sarah B. Cochran, and it comes out on May 18th as an ebook on Kindle and as a paperback, either in Amazon or in bookstores. And it's called A Lesser Mortal and the Unexpected Life of Sarah Cochran because she was a person who was in southwestern Pennsylvania at the turn of the 20th century in the coal and coke industries, competing with Frick and being very philanthropically active. But she's one of those people who just never made it into the historical narrative. She wasn't as big a name as Carnegie or Frick. She wasn't really known beyond certain geographies because of the type of philanthropy that she did. So I look at her as being treated like she was a lesser mortal, so to speak. And I talk about this as her unexpected life because she grew up at a time when women in particular didn't really have a way to plan to have careers of any significance or even of personal fulfillment. So I don't think that when she was growing up, she expected to have the life and the impact that she did. And it's interesting because today, if you're trying to find her, it's very hard to find her unless you already know that she's there. And most people probably aren't expecting to find a woman at the helm of coal and coke businesses at the turn of the 20th century. So I never intended to write a book about her. I only knew about her because I'm related to her. Her mother and my third great grandfather were siblings in the 19th century. And she put my great grandmother through college about 100 years ago. And when I was growing up in New Jersey, my parents and I would go to southwestern Pennsylvania almost once a month or so. And for every major holiday and family weddings, when we would go to the family church, it was one that Sarah built. I had seen her mansion in the area. So she had this continuing presence, even though she died in 1936, and I was going back there in the 70s and 80s and 90s. When I took my husband there in 2015, he was seeing some of the buildings that she built, and he was hearing about what she contributed philanthropically. And he was amazed that he couldn't Google her name and find information about her. So he suggested that I write a Wikipedia entry for her, which I did. And then I decided I wanted to do a little more research, and I started writing some guest blog posts for museum websites. And I recorded a StoryCorps recording with a woman who is actually related to Sarah's husband and whose mother went through college with funding from Sarah. After that, I did a presentation for the Fayette County Historical Society, and based on the feedback I was getting on the presentation and on these different pieces that I wrote, I decided I was far enough along in research that I just wanted to keep going and try to write a short book about her, not necessarily, the 600-page tome with every detail from birth to death, but an introductory sort of biography that would talk about the contributions that she made and her growing up story. I was hoping that by doing that, and by not having a PhD in history, I've had a business career instead of an academic career. I was hoping that that might make it a little more accessible to people who might not be reading it from an academic standpoint. I was also hoping that academics might take details out of this book to use in their research and to find leads about a woman in the coal and coke industry. And my other hope was that people who might know of other people like her who have kind of been overlooked in the historical narrative might read it and look at ways that they might tell other people's stories, whether that's writing a book, writing an article, or donating artifacts from that person's life to a museum or an archive. So those were my goals for it. And that's really what brought me to the place of writing the book. So I'll give you an overview of Sarah's life. I'll spend more time talking about her suffrage involvement since this is a political organization and it's Women's History Month. That is probably where we want to spend a little bit more of our time. She lived in southwestern Pennsylvania. It's the area around Falling Water. If you've ever been to Falling Water and Nemacolin Woodlands, kind of near the West Virginia border, about an hour south of Pittsburgh. And she lived from 1857 to 1936. So her life pretty much overlapped the American women's suffrage movement. It also overlapped the era when laws were being passed to try to give married women more rights than they had before about 1850. The Seneca Falls Convention happened in 1848, so only 9 years before she was born. All of these changes were starting to take place in society for women. Sarah happened to be born into a very poor family. Her parents were farmers, but it doesn't look like they necessarily owned the farm that they were farming. And they were said to have been so poor that she and her sister had to share clothing to be able to go to school on alternate days. But she was very perseverant in trying to become educated. And ultimately, she got a job as a maid in the house of a man named Jim Cochran, who lived in that very same area. Jim Cochran was important locally because he pioneered the Connellsville coke industry about 30 years earlier in the 1840s. It's an industry that is really known or is associated with Frick more than Jim Cochran, because by the 1890s, Frick was really dominating that industry and Jim Cochran was dead by then. But when Sarah Cochran was his maid, he was a very important person in this community and extremely wealthy. He owned coal mines, he owned coking facilities, he was into some railroads, bridge projects, banks, electricity, everything you need to get into, kind of like the game of Monopoly. If you're trying to get coal out of a mine and get it sent to market or to turn it into coke. Coke isn't something that we hear about a lot in New Jersey. It's a byproduct of coal and it's used in making iron and steel. So that's what makes it a very lucrative project to be involved with, especially if you're not that far from Pittsburgh. So Jim Cochran was doing very well at this point, and he was starting to involve his sons in his family businesses. And his oldest son, Philip, is who he was grooming to take over ultimately and to get involved. But Philip fell in love with Sarah while she was the maid, and they got married in 1879, and they had one child later in 1880. This was a son named James. So time goes on. Jim passes away in the early 1890s. Philip takes over the family business for about 5 years, and then he passes away in 1899. He's about 49 years old at the time. He leaves everything to Sarah, which is kind of unusual when you think that this is businesses that are stretching from Western Pennsylvania to West Virginia to Tennessee. And it's not really an industry that's welcoming to women. In fact, women aren't legally allowed to work in or around coal mines in Pennsylvania at that time. And some miners even believed that it was bad luck if they were walking to the mine to work and a woman crossed their path. They would just turn around and go home because they thought they would be in an accident. So this is the sort of mindset that she's coming into as an unwitting businesswoman at this point. But it's very telling, I think, that Philip left everything to her. She's the sole executrix in his will, and she's supposed to control 1/3 of the estate for herself and the other 2/3 for their son for the next 2 years until he turns 21, and then this will be his. He's a student at the University of Pennsylvania at this point, and he's studying at Wharton. He's playing football. He's pledged Phi Kappa Psi. In 1901, he passes away 6 months before his 21st birthday because he gets a cold that turns into pneumonia, and that's the end. So you can imagine, not only is it difficult for Sarah to have just lost her husband not quite 2 years earlier, and now she's lost her only child all of a sudden, probably at a point in life when she assumed she had gotten past all of the childhood issues that you might have encountered between 1880 and 1900. She's going through the grieving process, and she's also faced with this difficult question of what do you do with all of these businesses that you were supposed to be done with 6 months from now? So she ends up taking over all of the businesses. She puts certain advisors in different positions, but she stays involved with the business, even if it means having to fight her own directors to put certain people into positions that she wanted them to have so that other directors might not take the business to Pittsburgh where she wouldn't be involved with it. I don't know exactly how involved she was in terms of being, a hands-on manager or a micromanager, or if she was someone who just made decisions that were very high level. But I do know that she was staying involved and that she put people she trusted in positions of authority when possible. Her life also took this other turn where she became very philanthropically active at this point. She's 44 years old when she loses her son and when all of these changes are taking place. So between her 40s and her 70s, she's very engaged in philanthropy. And she says in a particular letter that I've put in the appendix of the book that a doctor recommended to her when she was grieving that she think about all the people she could help. And she should think about the churches and schools specifically that she could aid. So this is kind of the turning point for her that gets her very interested in philanthropy. And she begins to start doing public philanthropy and very quiet philanthropy. The quiet philanthropy is putting people through college, like my great-grandmother, where there's not a scholarship fund or a foundation. Nobody knows exactly who she put through college, but we know there were multiple people who she saw as having promise locally. She's also involved in very public philanthropic activities. She builds a dormitory for men at Allegheny College and a dormitory for women at Otterbein University in Ohio. She becomes a trustee of Beaver College and American University and the first female trustee of Allegheny College. She also builds about 3 churches in southwestern Pennsylvania between 1902 and 1927 and becomes a benefactor of Phi Kappa Psi chapters since her son had been a member of that fraternity. She actually became such a benefactor to the chapter at West Virginia University that they still remember her as the mother of the chapter, and they ultimately named their fraternity house after her after she died. So I grew up never having any idea that this woman who I associated with this church was also the namesake of a fraternity house. So that was quite an interesting find for me. In 1916, she hosted the Methodist bishops of the world at her home, which was a 35 or more room mansion on about 600 acres of land in southwestern Pennsylvania. And this was supposed to have been the first time that the Methodist bishops ever had that meeting in a private home. So I don't know for sure if she was trying to exert particular influence or if she felt that this was a way to support her religious denomination. But it was a very interesting move that she made. And she was doing this at a time, it was 1916, so women still weren't voting. They had only been allowed to be delegates to the Methodist Church's General Conference, where all of the church decisions are made for about the last 15 or 16 years. So it's just a very interesting optic to the public to see a woman doing all of this at that time. I've noticed in reading articles about her that she's also always known as Mrs. Sarah Cochran, never Mrs. Philip Cochran. And I thought that was interesting for the era when she was operating, because if you read articles about suffrage events in Western Pennsylvania, it's generally a list of participants who are noted as Mrs. Husband's name. So I don't know if this was her indication of progressive thought at the time, or if she just didn't feel like she had to tell people who her husband was, because local people would have known who she had been married to and where her money came from. But it's a very interesting differentiator for her that I didn't see for other women who were involved in the suffrage movement with her. I don't know for sure why she got involved in suffrage. Her mother's side of the family has a common ancestor with me who goes back to the American Revolution in Monmouth County, New Jersey. So it's possible, and this is kind of a stretch, but it's possible that the family might have known that some women could vote in New Jersey under certain circumstances after 1776 and into the early 19th century. It's also possible that she came around to supporting suffrage as she grew up in the coal and coke industry. By having all of these companies that employed men, she was actually unable to cast a ballot to affect public policy when all of her employees, at least the ones with American citizenship, would have been able to vote in elections. So she might have come around to suffrage for that. Or she might have been influenced by the fact that she was serving on the American University Board of Trustees at the same time as William Jennings Bryan. And this was after he had already run unsuccessfully for President of the United States and after he had served as Secretary of State. So she had to have noticed that she was going into board meetings as his peer and going out of board meetings unable to do as much as go to the polls to cast a ballot. One of her nephews died on the Titanic, and I know in some cases that's the Titanic has been used as a reason to argue against women's suffrage in the early 20th century, but obviously that didn't stop her from supporting suffrage at all. In 1915, she actually hosted the largest fundraiser for women's suffrage in Western Pennsylvania, because the state was having a referendum in 1915, like some other states at the time. And there was so much work going on to try to convince male voters that they should support suffrage that Anna Howard Shaw was actually zooming around Pennsylvania and other states giving free lectures about suffrage. And one of those lectures happened at Sarah's home. So she opened up her house to everybody. There were ads in local papers saying everyone is invited. And people paid $1 per person to come to this event, see the inside of the house, see the grounds, hear Anna Howard Shaw speak, and listen to several opera singers performing arias from Thais and Aida. So they're getting the power of women's voices through opera and through, political lectures at this event too. And what's interested me the most about it is that, this is almost a time when some suffragists are using stunts to try to get the public's attention. Louisine Havemeyer, a couple of years later, uses a torch that looks like the Statue of Liberty's torch to try to light an effigy of President Wilson and ends up getting arrested for that. There are no stunts at Sarah's event. She's more aligned with NASA, and she just doesn't take that particular approach. The meeting wasn't run by her. It was run by other people who organized suffrage groups in that particular region of Pennsylvania. And it was called to order with a potato masher, which really caught my attention when I was reading articles about it from 1915. And apparently at this point, the concern in that area was that if women got the right to vote, they wouldn't be very domestic anymore. And it was such a concern that pro-suffrage groups actually printed cookbooks to raise money for suffrage and to convince people that voting or not, you're still going to be able to cook and be domestic and all of this. So someone called the meeting to order with a potato masher. This is in this mansion that's over 35 rooms. It has its own private, railroad stop. It's the home of a woman who probably hasn't had to boil water since 1895 or so if she doesn't want to. So it's kind of unusual on a lot of levels. But, that was her contribution to women's suffrage. Ultimately, the referendum failed in Pennsylvania, but the story is just so striking of how that happened. And I don't know if her involvement in sharing her home for the suffrage event was anything that she thought deeply about, or if she just had the biggest house with the most land and therefore the fewest parking problems and, all of these other details that people think of when they're choosing venues. But she really brought politics into a woman's home when she did this. And this was around the time when a woman was supposed to be this moral authority in the home, and she wasn't supposed to go out of the home and get involved in politics and business and all of these areas that were considered, a man's world. So in having this rally at her own home, she just brought politics right to her living room for people. And, I just think that that was one of the interesting things to take out of that. So she went on after that. She went on to build a high Gothic revival style church in this small railroad town. This is the church that my family always attended, so I grew up knowing it. And then remained active philanthropically up until she died in 1936. Her memorial service in 1936 was actually called the Ministry of Woman. So this is a person who could have left the world with any thoughts for people that she or the minister in her church wanted. It could have been about ethics or business or where the Methodist Church was going. And she chose to close out her life with thoughts about the contributions that biblical women had made and the contributions that she had made. I've never been able to find a copy of this memorial service or the text that the minister used, so I don't know who the biblical women were that he mentioned, but it's just such an unusual topic for 1936 in this particular area. And I think it just suggests that she was a little ahead of her time for quite a few years. So that's really her story in a nutshell. I know I've had to skim over certain parts of the coal and coke industry or some of the work that she's done just to focus a little more on suffrage details. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have about anything I've talked about or that you might be curious about her.
I want to know who she left her money to.
Oh, well, it went to different places. She left money to the Methodist Church, the local church, and I think also to some of its missions and programs. She also left money to various Phi Kappa Psi chapters in West Virginia University and the University of Pennsylvania. She left some to Allegheny College, and I think to Otterbein University as well. She left her mansion to her brother and his wife because they had been living with her for a few years before she died. She was an invalid for a while. So that's where large portions of the money went.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have family members that have stories about her that have been handed down, and that's how you found out some information? Or, how did you go about finding out? A lot of this wasn't written down somewhere, right?
Right.
It's been difficult.
Yeah, the family story that we had was about my great-grandmother going to college because of her, and also playing basketball in college, which always fascinated me when I was growing up, as I knew this great-grandmother, I guess, for about the first 4 years that I was alive. Um, and then the church in southwestern Pennsylvania had a very brief one-page biography of her in some of their anniversary materials that they published. But it didn't have information about Beaver College and American University and the fraternity, and a lot of details about the philanthropy that she got involved with. So I started looking around for bulletins from different colleges that were mentioned in historic newspapers. I started searching more through newspapers to find news about what companies she owned, because the companies that she owned were never really clear to me before I started doing the research. And there's more clarity now, but it's still not entirely clear to me. Just because of the way records were kept, it feels like there's probably more companies that she was involved with that I don't know about. So that was one way that I found information. I started contacting archivists at the colleges where she gave donations or where she was a trustee, to see what information they had. And generally, I found that I couldn't get into minutes from trustees' meetings, which was fine, but generally archivists could point me to college newspapers or yearbooks or any other publications. Like sometimes there's an official history of the college that's been published, and that would mention her contributions. At Allegheny College, that was a real find because it pointed out that she was contributing more than Andrew Carnegie during this one particular building fund. So the president of the college actually recognized Carnegie and Sarah as the two most important people when buildings were being erected on campus. And that's not something you would find out easily. So it was a lot of newspapers, a lot of archivists material, and then there was genealogical research that I did anytime from like the 80s up until about 2010 or 2015, just for my own use, that I could add to this because we share a particular common ancestor. Oh, and the fraternity in West Virginia actually had an amazing amount of information. One of their alums wrote a 500 or so page book about the history of their chapter, and included a transcription of a letter that she wrote to them in 1935, because they had been sending her flowers every year for Mother's Day. And in 1935, she sent them this basically a dress to go with her letter, and talked about how she got involved in philanthropy. And their history talked also about how she bought the fraternity house for them, and how she would host their alums and students at her home for parties at times. So they were just a wealth of information, and they seemed to really appreciate her more than some other organizations where there seemed to be some institutional memory loss.
So is that house under the Cochran Foundation still? I mean, is it become a museum, or what has happened to it?
It went through several owners since she passed away, and United Steelworkers bought it in the 70s or around 1980. In the 80s, they used to give tours of it led by docents. And I think that even continued to the early 2000s. But now it's basically a wedding venue. And they also have a small hotel on site and a golf course. And they do training for labor relations for the steel workers there. So that's its primary use. And it's on the National Register of Historic Places, but it's the United Steelworkers that owns it.
Interesting. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if there's any reference to, with her philanthropic work, you said to universities, do you ever remember hearing Shenandoah University at all?
No, but that doesn't mean that she couldn't have been involved. with it somehow.
Okay, because I went there. It's actually in Virginia. When I went there, it was a private school and it was a private Methodist school.
Okay.
And it's very close to the West Virginia border. So I just wondered if there was any connection there. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, because she seemed to stay around Methodist causes, education, and Phi Kappa Psi, and generally the region that her family was from.
Okay.
So it's very possible that she could have been involved with it, and maybe it didn't get mentioned in a particular article, or it was maybe mentioned in college materials, but not necessarily in Western Pennsylvania or other places.
And I just like to make a comment, just listening to you and how you told the story. It was just very interesting, compelling, and I can just imagine the book is written just as well. And I'm hoping you can let us know how to get the book.
Yeah, well, the book will be available on Amazon. If you have a Kindle, you can pre-order it now. If you prefer paperback, then it's available starting May 18th. And actually, if you pre-order the Kindle version, it doesn't appear in your Kindle until May 18th either. If you prefer to work with a bookstore, bookstores should be able to get a copy of the book for you because it's going through the Ingram distribution network for books. So if you give them the title and author's name, they should be able to order it.
Okay, great.
That's also as of May 18th.
Well,
Can
good
you
luck with
just,
the sales.
can you just put the exact title in the chat so everybody could see it?
Yeah. Let's see.
That would be good. I plan to get the book when it comes out. I was going to get it right away when you texted me about it coming out, but I don't have a Kindle, so.
I don't either. So I can't even pre-order my own book.
Oh, maybe you should get one.
Yeah. I'm just typing it now.
Yeah. It was really interesting. I'm so glad you came and told us about this.
Thank you.
It was really a great story.
Thank you.
I wish that more people got on, and especially one of my granddaughters was supposed to get on, and I want young people to hear this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
because they don't realize
And
how
I think
hard it was for women.
And I think so much of what she went through is still what people are going through today. I mean, women and other groups too, because one of the things I really liked about Sarah's hosting a suffrage event was that she was publicly proclaiming her support of women's suffrage, which also meant she was publicly embracing the one thing about herself that set her apart from everybody else in her industry, which was gender. And I think in a lot of cases, even if it's just in a business environment, people can wonder, when should they fit in with everyone else? And when should they emphasize something about themselves that is very different from everyone else? And I think Sarah had to go through that. And she was a first or only in some situations. And I think we're going to have that for a long time for a lot of groups of people. So there's quite a bit. And one of the themes that came out to me in this was that things happened well because people tended to see someone's value and do something about it. When her father-in-law tried to sell his Coke product in Cincinnati, it was because someone understood that it could be used in iron and steel manufacturing and said, I'll pay you for this. And that started an entire industry. Philip Cochran saw value in Sarah, regardless of her being a maid or having some other job title, and they got married. And it just kind of goes on like that the rest of her life. And I think everybody wants to be valued in some way, whether it's personally or professionally, and that's just a universal sort of thing. So.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
I mean, I noticed there's some people here from Clinton Township that maybe if you put your contact information in the chat, they might want you to come to their club meeting or something.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, since you're a native of Clinton Township.
Yeah, and it's very easy to Zoom, so yeah.
So was when Sarah started, well, once Phillips was attracted to Sarah, was his parents upset about that? Were they welcoming her, or how did, because a lot of people with that social stature would not have wanted their son to be with a maid.
Yeah, I don't know how they reacted to it. What I have heard is that she was never fully accepted by Pittsburgh society. And the implication was always that it was because of her financial background. And I assume some people probably thought they were raising daughters who might be good marital candidates for young men who were going to take over their father's businesses. I had also heard that sometimes after they were married, they would get invited to an event that was supposed to be an invitation for both Philip and Sarah, and her name would be intentionally left off the invitation. And the people just made it known. But that was always about other people outside of the family. So I'm not exactly sure what the parents or his siblings thought. I'm trying to think. His mother actually wasn't from any particularly wealthy background because his father wasn't extraordinarily wealthy when he married her. These were all local people from that area. So in a way, even though she might not have seemed like a good choice to some people in other circles, she was a very logical choice because she was local to, like her mother-in-law was, and they seemed to have some common values and maybe a common approach to things.
Wow.
And someone asked about the Titanic. I've heard, let's see, how was the Titanic used as an argument against women's suffrage? Some people said that if you look at the fact that women were allowed on lifeboats because of their gender and men weren't, that if women then wanted to have the right to vote, they were looking to have it both ways by being protected because of their gender, but also wanted to be equal regardless of their gender. So that's the sort of argument that was getting made. It's not really the best argument because I think sometimes the counter argument would be, there weren't really enough lifeboats for everybody on the Titanic and there were design flaws, or you could start thinking about what would have happened if a woman had been involved in the design. But that's how the argument was made against suffrage because of that.
Just
Wow. It's great. Great stuff, really.
Thank you. And I know there are more people like her too. I mean, that's where I just hope that other people will try to share an article or a blog post or something. I know not everyone's interested in writing a book because it just takes a lot of time to do that and people are busy, but there are other ways to tell other people's stories. And there's just so many interesting people who contributed and their contributions have impacted a particular community so much, but nobody really knows about it outside of a particular area.
Have the local people embraced the book at all, or have you presented it to them? Or
I haven't really
talked
presented
about
it to them. It's going through advanced reader stages right now. So there's one woman who did the StoryCorps recording with me a couple of years ago, who was one of the advanced readers, and she's in Western Pennsylvania, and she loves it. Now she'll be kind of a skewed viewpoint because she's related to the Cochran family. She's a genealogist like I am, so there's a lot of detail that she's interested in. But she also said that one of the things that she liked about the book was that it talks about what Sarah was doing philanthropically and how it would affect people in the future. And she really liked that because Sarah put her mother through college, and then she went through college and her daughters went through college in the same way that my great-grandmother went to college, my dad went to college, I went to college. And, there's this ripple effect to different philanthropic acts that
Yes. Yeah.
So I think she picked up on that. And I'm waiting to hear back from other people in Western Pennsylvania. One advanced reader I never associate him with Western Pennsylvania because he's actually teaching at an American school in China, but he studies the Appalachian region. And he was very happy with it because generally you get Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as Pennsylvania history, and this is something that's not quite in either one of them. So he's hoping that it will help people who are interested in learning more about Northern Appalachia to see the people who were there and what they were doing.
It's great.
And talk about ripple effect. I mean, your own family must be very proud and, you know, I think very happy that you did this because it brings to light a lot of information about their past. And for your daughter too, to know more about, you know, the past and your family life.
Yeah.
I think it's great that you did that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else have any more questions for Kimberly?
No.
Did Sarah leave any personal papers or diaries to give you further insights into her motive? There's a question in the box there.
Oh, okay.
I think it's from we were curious as to you know, what's next for you, because obviously there's a lot more of this story still to tell, I think, and to find out, right? And whether, you know, did she leave any papers or diaries that where you still see clues that have got to be followed?
Yeah, I don't know if she kept a diary or if there were any additional papers that might be around. One of the problems that I ran into was that there are very few people who seem to have access to information about her locally. And I had spoken with one of them several years ago when I was doing a blog post that was basically a short biography of Sarah, and he was very helpful with information. But then a couple of years later, when I was working on the book, it was just impossible to make contact with him. So that's one of the areas where, because she's known in these small areas and a few people have access to information, it can be difficult to get that information sometimes. I also don't know what survived and what didn't. So hopefully if people read this in the Morgantown, West Virginia area and Southwestern Pennsylvania, and maybe a few other areas, it might spawn some activity or convince people that they should, you know, look through paperwork that they might have. Maybe they should donate it to a historical society in the area or to Linden Hall. So, yeah, because that was very difficult to find any of her own words. She was quoted in newspapers occasionally, and one of her letters was quoted in a newspaper. So I was seeing a newspaper from the early 2000s that quoted one of her letters. And when I made some inquiries about the person who owned that letter, he had died since the article was written, and nobody really knew what happened to any of his belongings related to that family. So, yeah.
It's a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an opportunity for oral history to be done because there are probably people who can just sit down with a microphone and start talking about the family history that they have, or the family story that they have that relates to her. But I also feel like that might be better done by someone in Western Pennsylvania or West Virginia who can sit down with people and who's known in the community too.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that everybody got their questions in, and I really appreciate your coming and talking to us. And it was a fascinating story. I just loved it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can't wait
Thank you for
to
having me.
And my daughter went to West Virginia U. I'm going to ask her if she knows about this fraternity house, because she was a sorority.
Okay.
She was an AOPI, they called them.
Okay, so this is
I'm a front pie. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So it'll be interesting if she ever heard anything about this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll have to ask her that.
Yeah. Apparently there's a painting of Sarah in the fraternity house because they sent me a photo of it. I mean, it's funny how highly they still regard her there. I was very impressed by the information that they had. So,
Yeah, it's good. It's good to know.
yeah.
All right, well, I guess that's it, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming
Thank
too. I hope
you.
you enjoyed it. And I'll see some of you on Thursday at we have a Short County Committee meeting.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Bye, everybody.
It was
Thank
really
you.
great.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kimberly.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. Very
Thank you.
impressive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
When I
Bye.
get the book, I hope you'll autograph it for me.
Yes.
There you go.
All right.
Okay.
Good night,
Bye now.
everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.